Hi everyone. Hello. I would like to remind everybody, if you're in the right room, this is for the session that was originally the A session. So if you still want to, you still have a chance now to move to the B session. It's next door in the C room. Our next speaker is Jefferson Bailey. He's program manager at the Internet Archive.
All right, thanks. This is great. I get 2 rooms, so don't touch the mic. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for coming out. It's exciting to be at the GA in Stanford and on the West Coast. So, yep, Jefferson Bailey, Internet Archive, and my talk is Web Archives as Research Data Sets. So my outline, I'll talk sort of like the landscape that sort of set the stage for the work that we are trying to do. What are the sort of catalyzing opportunities and what are the challenges? Programmatic approaches. I'll sort of make a case both for collections, which I don't think have come up as much here at the GA as they could otherwise, and the case for derivation as an access method. I'll talk about Archivate Research Services, which is something we launched recently, and then I'll sort of close going with the hermeneutics of web data and looking at some of the frailties and affordances of working with web data and how sort of analytical methods become both reductions and abstractions. So program maturity, this is from the National Digital Stewardship Alliance Web Archiving Survey recently, and this is something that we do every couple of years to sort of gauge the growth of web archiving in the United States. And you see this sort of great upswing in the last couple of years of many more programs being involved in this community, collecting web content, building web collections. And so there's both a great recent interest institutionally and as a collecting focus, but also going back to '96, and that's IA, but even within the United States, you sort of see that many of these institutions have been doing web archiving now for at least a decade in many cases, building special collections, and that these collections now are of a significant size and longitudinal breadth to sort of support new access models. So, concurrent with this growth in web archiving in, cultural heritage and library archives and museums, we also see this a similar growth in data-driven methods of scholarly analysis. The digital humanities are probably familiar with to most people. Political science and social sciences are also starting to do and have been doing a lot of data-driven work. And so, just threw up some examples here. The data mining with criminal intent is the Digging into Data NEH sponsored project. The Stanford University is the Robert Creeley collection of personal papers, and that's sort of a network graph of his email correspondence. Digitized shipping logs, digitized court records, and semantic analysis. So we've seen a lot of data-driven work in the humanities and scholarly community, focused in the large part on digitized textual corpora. So those are both sort of catalyzing moments, data-driven analysis and sort of program growth and maturity. At the same time, of course, there are challenges. So we don't really have as much of this challenge because we have all of these, but for working with data even in the sort of terabyte scale for many of the institutions that are joining the web archiving community there's a technical challenge, and the work format, of course, is concatenated sort of ad hoc packaging thing, and it doesn't necessarily support out of the box a lot of the types of data-driven inquiry that people are doing. So there's both the technical challenge, but there's also the sort of local institutional challenge, and I have this quote on here from the IIPC funded report, Web Archives, the Future, almost 5 years old at this point, and the learning curve is currently too steep for the non-technical user, and the amount of support available at most institutions is minimal, if present at all, and this must change. If it doesn't, Web Archives will be securely stored in boxes covered with dust. I love that last sentence. It really doesn't make any sense. I don't really know why you would put a web archive in a box. They're obviously have the dusty archive metaphor, and it's kind of ridiculous, frankly. But there is they do have a sort of key point here that local mechanisms within regular archives and special collections and libraries don't necessarily have the expertise or even the delivery mechanisms for supporting like data-driven work. I mean, how do you even give people web data for them to analyze? How do you support their research interest in using data from web collections? So there is both a local challenge as well. So when we were sort of surveying this, this environment, we were trying to think about what are the sort of key elements that we could use to operationalize and build a service around making web archives available as research data sets. And sort of the two key concepts that we focused on were the idea of collections and the idea of derivation. So collections, we've heard a lot certainly about domain level and TLDs and sort of big web archives. But I think when you think about collected, curated web archive collections, there's a lot of potential for research use in ways that are slightly different than some of the larger web archives. So they, of course, have some human mediation. They're collected and selected. They often build off of traditional collecting expertise out of the library. So subject specialists and faculty liaisons building these collections, often in concert with faculty and domain experts. And collections often are crawled at regular intervals, so they have great periodicity, which allows for a sort of more finite longitudinal analysis. So we sort of have collections as this great smaller but analyzable corpus of materials. And then we have derivation. So even for some of these relatively newer collections that are crawling at a pretty good scale, they can have a dozen, 12, 15, 20 terabyte collections, and those still are very challenging for people to do data analysis on. So we're in thinking of the works and the size of these collections, what's sort of the key that allows people to do the type of analysis they're interested in, but not necessarily interact with the full data set. So derivation is pulling out key features to support specific types of analysis. So from that, we launched Archivate Research Services, and I'll talk a little bit about the data sets that we started with. It's been out about a month. There's a bit.ly URL. And these are three types, so I'll just go right into them. WATs, I think WATs have been in the web archiving community for a while, so they're probably not unfamiliar to many. It's a web archive transformation file. It's sort of an extensible format, and it contains sort of key metadata. So it's just basically a much smaller resource that has provenance information, timestamp, IP, doc size, content type, and also sort of key elements that can support a number of other types of analysis. Doc title, meta keywords, description text for text mining, as well as links, embeds, and the associated anchor text for sort of link analysis. So advantages of this, it's about high variance, but about 20% the size of a work, so it's much smaller data set to work with. It maps directly to the work, so every resource in the work will be a resource in the WAT. So, there's sort of, you can link back to it intellectually if necessary. It's packaged in JSON, which is a lot easier to work with than the works themselves. And it enables multiple types of analysis, so text mining, data mining, link mining, trend analysis, and it can be done across a whole collection. So we did some sort of hacky, prototypey, researchy to try to use some of these when we were creating them. And so here's about 8 months from a fracking collection done as frequency of term frequency over time, and then put into a stream graph visualization. So you can see how some of these words were more common at certain periods and less common, and this sort of tracks the conversation within this collection. Another one, this one has come up in other talks as well, is geomapping IP addresses, and this is over about almost a decade of Latin American collection, and you can see how the collection grows over time. So that's WATS. LGA is longitudinal graph analysis, and so this is, of course, for making graph files. It contains, for an entire collection, every URL and what URLs it links to and when, and so it's a big aggregate file of linking behaviors across a collection. It's two separate files that you use together. One is tying the URL to an identifier, and then its identifier, timestamp, and then set of identifiers. So graph analysis is pretty common, and this is a way to extract it out of the entire collection and allow people to do graph analysis. Very tiny, 1% of a collection. It encompasses an entire collection from its origin to current crawling. And of course, graph analysis is intended to study associations, affiliations, and linking behaviors over time. So this is just, of course, a pretty animated Gephi visualization. It's sort of maybe a little too far away from scholarly inquiry because it just looks cool. But this is the human rights collection, and the way it pulses is actually when crawls happen, because this is a collection that doesn't crawl with incredible frequency. And you see down there at the bottom, I don't really know how to operate this thing. A sort of like link farmy thing that actually is a little community of affiliation. So within actually Gephi, you can dig down into this and see what each URL is and how it's linking. But this is very traditional graph analysis work. Another thing that you can do with linked graph file is actually find identifiers and what are the most frequently linked to. So this is a fashion blog collection. It's about 10 million URLs. And we took, I think, the top 500 image file formats that were linked to across the entire fashion blogs collection. And so this is actually a failed research experiment because the idea originally was to slice it by season, so fall, winter, summer, spring, and see whether there was actually more black clothing in winter and white clothing in summer. And it turns out not really. So this is actually plotted by hue and by brightness. So we're sort of doing content analysis on the most linked to images, and they were the most linked to because of the graph file. So that's the LGA. Wayne, this is another one that we're pretty excited about, Web Archive named entity files. So this is using Stanford's named entity recognition tools, which have come up in other talks as well, extracting all the names of people, places, and organizations from a collection. And that includes, the timestamp of when it's captured as well as a checksum. Oops, so advantages, Wayne, once again, is very small. It maps directly to a WARC, so every WARC will have a corresponding Wayne of resources with extracted entities. It's compact, it's easy to work with. The entities themselves are in more or less in a JSON blob. And of course, like anything, it allows you to track change over time of people names, place names, organization names. So a little prototypey analysis. We ran it on, again, the Columbia University Human Rights Collection. Thank you to Alex and Anna who are here because they let us use this collection in all sorts of internal testing that we do. So this is about 300 gigabytes, 4 million docs from October. And you can see, some traditional names that you would recognize from a human rights collection and some that you wouldn't, and the same for organizations and entities. And you can see how many were discovered over this collection, so a lot. So it works quite well. Another one was the Ferguson collection. So this is from sort of the fall in 2014 when we were doing a lot of this preliminary work. Ferguson was going on. For those not familiar, Ferguson was a sort of racially charged incident where a white police officer killed an unarmed African-American youth, and there were lots of protests to follow, and it's sort of still going on as far as a greater movement about police inequality. And you'll see some traditional ones, Michael Brown and Darren Wilson, but also, of course, some that you wouldn't necessarily think of as being the top named entities out of 650,000 that were discovered over 4 months of crawling. So those are the 3 data sets launched about a month ago. What are, of course, the goals? Some of these are pretty obvious. I think Web Archives as research data sets has come up in other talks, and people are giving access, of course, to WARCs and in some cases WATs as well. But it is kind of a new and emerging access model that we all are still working with and haven't quite figured out entirely. It will enable new insights to collections. It will facilitate computational analysis, which we're having a lot more researchers interested in mining Web Archive collections. It operationalized beyond the domain scale. So, we do have, our Archivist service has over 300 institutions building curated collections. And so we're really interested in thinking about research data sets that are from curated collections and not necessarily from global or domain crawls. The other sort of big community positive, I think, is that it allows us or the community or to leverage the Internet Archive infrastructure. So we obviously have a lot of compute power within IA, and we're excited about the ability to use that compute power for institutions that don't have local ability to actually do processing at that scale to create these data sets. And of course, increase the use and visibility and value of collection. So I've talked about it in the sort of, it did launch and it's prototypey, but we're not ignoring the fact that there has to be a sustainability and a business and a service model if we're going to be exploring. We are a self-sustaining nonprofit. We're not funded by taxpayers. We get grants, but grants are like the worst sustainability mechanism in existence. So this is just a picture of the interface, and so you can actually go in within the collection tool and actually request specific data sets. So what are we thinking about in the future? We've launched recently, but we have lots of future plans. API access, there are sort of command line tools for getting the data sets, but more programmatic access will sort of enable us to make that transfer a little easier. Additional data sets, of course. Researcher accounts, so we actually get a lot of researchers that are interested in building sort of what is the web sphere collections, I think is the term that people tend to use for researcher-driven collecting mechanisms. And so I think this will be interesting to see. Not only can they build a research corpus, 5 minutes, but they can also actually get data sets out of it. So tutorials and workshops will be at RESAW in June, doing a long workshop using these tools and building them and using them to make data visualizations, second level derivations and aggregations, enrichment annotations, and other service models. So this is one service model, is research data sets. And I think the Buddha project yesterday, which is one of my favorites, was also a different model of having micro grants and some development resources. But I think there's others. There's sort of give people access to a cluster, put a bunch of data in there, see what they do. There's sort of the paired programming type approach where you match data scientist and humanist. So I think there's lots of models still to be explored to find out how Web Archives' data sets can be best utilized and most sustainable. So finally, I was going to talk a little bit about the hermeneutics of web data to try to pull back and think about it in a conceptual way and not just in the sort of service model. And so I have this quote from Gibbs and Owens, Hermeneutics of Data: just as the problematic notion of text has not undermined the hermeneutic process, nor should the notion of data. And so I put this in here because I think a lot of the white papers and a lot of the projects talk about methodological problems with web archives and with web data. And I find a lot of these to be not incredibly different than analog traditional archival collections, but they sort of evoke some very different forms of anxiety because what we're collecting is so close to what is actually still live on the web. We're a little more removed from problems of collection and selection. Incompletion is something that, of course, is endemic within traditional archival collections, and it's really no different for web collections. And I sort of call it the inherent vice of web archives, and that's really not that different in many ways than a lot of the frailties of analog collections. So I sort of want us to get past some of those methodological challenges to sort of embrace using web collections more. So how can we do that? Better pathways to interpretation through tools and methods for the transversal between reduction and abstraction. So that's a Franco Moretti phrase. He's here in Stanford, in the Stanford Literary Lab, and does a lot of big data analysis on literary corpora. And he sort of talks a lot about how we have these fine-grained items that we end up with after data analysis and how they interact with abstractions and conceptual ideas. And so when we think of derived data sets and sort of an entity and how that interacts with a corpus as far as our interpretive relationship with it, I think that making that transversal easier both technically but also operationally will sort of help move the field forward. And then a unit of analysis comes up a lot in talking about Web Archive data and research data sets. And the traditional model has been very URL based. It's been way back and plug it in and look at it. As we think about data sets extracted from things, we're going to get farther and farther away from URL as a defining entity. So a graph or a entity or a named person can be many steps of removal from the actual collection that is being curated and built. And so that sort of unit of analysis will actually be somewhat independent from the web and even its nature as web data as we start to combine it with traditional data sets, OCR text, Twitter crawls, other types of data. And sort of the last idea is moving it forward is comfort with greater technical mediation at multiple levels. So there's a lot of technology involved, not just in the crawling and the curation, but obviously we're doing it as well in the derivation process. And of course, any of these data sets can be themselves derived again, and they can be combined and annotated, and that will all be sort of a level of technical mediation that I think as a community, we just need to be more comfortable with, especially when we start to think about the granularity of the data that we'll be analyzing and its relationship to full collections. So this is my last slide. I'm more or less on time, I think. And I just have a lot of things, and I'm not going to read them. But sort of thinking about research data sets as access mechanisms and thinking about with program maturity, with some of these collections having grown a significance of size and breadth, that we can really start to focus less on building programs and more on providing the data. And the last one is sort of focusing on community advocacy and all custodial tools. And this is not just national libraries or big institutions or people like us with lots of server space, but also these smaller institutions involved in web archiving and the sort of long tail of institution types that will be vocal in our community and wanting to provide these types of services, but not necessarily represented in all events. So that's it. Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you. Trying to find a microphone.
Questions?
Yes, we definitely want to do questions.
Oh, okay. They'll be online.
Sorry?
They'll be online. Can I use the questions to say all the things I forgot to say during my talks?
Let's just see what the audience
I'm
wants
just
to
kidding.
know.
Yeah.
Are there any questions? It was so comprehensive.
I'll take that as a compliment.
Definitely. Jay.
Jay has a question. Probably does.
I wondered then, so, I think that's all great, and I think that's definitely clear that these are definitely kind of artifacts I think that we're interested in using and exploring. And, from experience, we had like a Hackfesty thing, and we presented a bunch of poor devs with 50 terabytes of WARCs and went, go and do something cool with that. And they went, not a chance, and kind of wandered off. So giving them some kind of discrete slices of insightful bits I think would be very valuable. So are you going to make some scripts which I can just kind of throw at my WARCs and then generate these things? Because that'd be awesome. Thank you very much.
Yes. So, I talked a little bit about like second level derivations, and I think that's the next step, and we are already working on that. So, and that came up in a couple of other talks. So it's like, yes, and I try, sort of the point of the slide is that you'll have your WARCs, and then you'll have your WATs, and then you'll have a sort of candidate list of seeds from the WATs, and then you'll want just meta tags from that list. And so it's going to just be layered and layered, farther and farther away. So and we hear a lot for people that want interfaces to do that work, to poke at it and say, I want all the titles from the 8,000 URLs that I've discovered in this subset of WATs that were a collection. So, yeah. Oh yeah, you don't need us. You can just do it.
So thinking about that long, fat tail of small to medium-sized web archiving institutions that are using Archive-It and your services, what are your hopes or expectations or draft models of how you'd like those institutions to work with you to together popularize these formats and these services?
Yeah, so I think the thing, for us, we do have researchers that come to us, but we're not set up in the way of a traditional archive or library as far as researcher support, direct interaction with an academic community of researchers. So it's not just use cases. I think use cases are pretty well defined at this point in web archives as far as what researchers want and think of. But that sort of second level of support will drive next-gen tools, like the things that Jay was asking about. So I think with a more direct, having a more direct conversation with users is what the Archivate community and the smaller institution community has that can benefit us who don't have such a direct relationship. So, in testing models, so talking about multiple different researcher support models, and it's not going to be just data sets or just grants or this pairing mechanism. So I think that'll have to be tested at the local level, right?
Thanks a lot.
Okay, thanks.
Let's move right up to our next speakers. Ian Milligan, Assistant Professor for History at the University of Waterloo, Canada. Let's see. Right. Okay. Thanks very much.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me in the back? Historians need to begin to think about web archives. This might be self-apparent to most of you in this room, but it isn't for my profession. Because, as I've explained in other venues, I believe that historians are fundamentally unprepared to engage with the quantity of digital sources that are going to transform our craft. The advent of the World Wide Web, both with born digital sources that can shed so much light on human culture and activity after the advent of web archive material in roughly 1996, presents a challenge to us as professionals. Things that would never have been preserved before are, and there are unparalleled opportunities for social historians to capture the broad context of the time that they're studying. And most importantly, I always like to underscore to my colleagues that I don't think you can do justice to the 1990s and beyond if you do not consider the World Wide Web. And this holds true for all branches of our historical profession. Political historians can't do justice to elections without understanding blogs, the websites, later on the tweets, that surround not only elections, but the everyday process of making policy, understanding public sentiment, and reaching out to the electorate. Military historians will have the voices of rank-and-file soldiers playing out on discussion boards around the web. Cultural and social historians, of which I count myself, the source base is even more evident, the impact of online and offline culture playing out, and the voices of everyday people that would not be lost. Yes, the web is not a perfect democracy. There are many lower income people who still don't have access to the web. There's age and racial cleavages as well. There's those who are generating content now on these, which is really hard to generate content, versus those who use laptops and so forth. We can't forget any of that. But we are still expanding our percentage of the traces of the past that are being preserved, and we can't forget that either. So to answer this question, no. If we don't study web archives, then you can't do a history of the 1990s and beyond. And this is coming sooner than we think. My first period of study that I wrote my first book on was the 1960s, and so I know that historiography well. The 1960s happened. By 1986, you've got Canadian and American historiographies about that question, and by the mid-1990s, you've got dissertations, articles, journals, everything is growing about that field. And we're now entering that distance from the 60s from the birth of the web today, that this is coming down soon. That historians need to start. Because if we don't start engaging as historians and we don't start thinking about what this is going to take place, I like to sort of think of a nightmare scenario. And I don't think the Wayback Machine is necessarily going to be how we do serious historical research on the web, and that's well-covered material. But I fear that historians will, like we have with so much other digital sources, begin to rely critically on date-ordered keyword search results, putting them at the mercy of search algorithms they don't understand. And that if we let that happen, I fear that historians could eventually just be left out of post-1996 research, just like we were left out of the Google Ngram project. Because when they went to find historians to join that project, we basically said no, because we don't like to work in teams, we don't like numbers, as Jane mentioned yesterday, and we're basically afraid of computers, and that our profession could just be left behind. So this matters. But what will these web archives look like? And so here I am, I'm practicing historian. What do the web archives look like that I'm using? And they come in very different shapes and very different sizes. There's more that Jefferson spoke about, the LGAs and stuff like that I won't talk about today. There's ARC files, there's WARC files, the little differences that screw up everything I do. But in general, these are the formats I want to talk about. So there's 3 case studies I've been using. One is the Wide Web Scrape, which is the March to December 2011 sort of sample of the World Wide. It's a scrape of the World Wide Web, and I'm using a smaller sample. There's the GeoCities End of Life Torrent from 2009 that Archive team put together. And then there's the Archive It Longitudinal Collections, the Canadian Political Parties and Labor Organization dataset, which ranges from 2005 to 2014. All of them offer the same profound similarity. They offer windows into the lives of everyday people, windows into the lives of sources that otherwise I wouldn't have had access to. But the differences, although they have that shared promise, the differences mean that they require an incredible range of technical skills, and there's no common platform that I, as an end user, can turn to, because these 3 different case studies use very different tools. So let's start briefly with the first case study. As I said, it's the Wide Web Scrape. It's around 80 terabytes in total. You can grab it on the Internet Archive. It comes to 85,570 WARC files, each 1 gigabyte in size, as well as the CDX files that give that metadata for us to understand. As I was starting out, I think of this case study as similar in some ways to traditional humanistic inquiry, just on a bigger scale, that it makes sense to me as a historian. And it makes sense to me because historians love finding aids, and the CDX file is in some ways kind of a perfect finding aid. You've got the reverse order domain, which I initially wondered why that was, and now I realize because it keeps all the .cas together. Yeah, I'm figuring this stuff out. And here we can see this is from my alma mater, York University in Toronto. It's a labor history journal. It was scraped on July 14th, 2011 at 7:37 and 26 milliseconds. It was redirected to a journal file, and then I could find it in the WARC file itself. And then in my explorations, I've been using the .ca subset of this, and I've isolated about 7% of it from those WARC files, looking at about 622,365 URLs. I like this because it makes sense to me as a traditionally trained historian. The CDX files are my finding aids. I look at those finding aids. I figure out what WARC files I'm going to download. I take them. They're too big for me as a historian. They're too big for me as a historian, really, to deal with in a traditional Faculty of Arts. I take the WARC files, I transform them. I think it's very important that I document how I transform them. We have to understand how this works. I use WARC tools, sort of an older depreciated version, which runs them to links, generates pretty good full text, and then I put them into Apache Solr so I can read them and search them and discover them. The findings have been pretty useful, and this is a method that I've been using a lot on most of the web archives I play with. I use the Caret2 clustering workbench. You can read files from Google, Bing, PubMed, but also what local Solr instance you have. And so here, for example, I'm looking up children. I'm a youth and childhood historian. And here we're seeing in that .ca file, we've got lots of Health Canada results. We've got businesses, we've got university websites, and so forth. The visualizations help me find the files I want to find. In this graph, can't really see because of the contrast, but these are obviously the cluster labels, and the dots are the documents themselves. So this dot here belongs to both Christian education and early learning, and so when you actually click on it, you get the plain text, and then you can go back to the Wayback Machine. And I found that to be a really good method for me figuring out how to use these files. The problem is with keyword searches is that you need to know what you're looking for. And keywords change, and keywords drive our research. And there's a broader argument to be made about how historians have become overnight a Control-F discipline, that you need to know what you're looking for. And so I've been playing around with link structures. I've been playing around with NER, other ways we can extract information. And so ironically, Jimmy's presenting next door, but I've been using his work-based platform with the Wide Web Scrape. Here are 622,000 of those sites, about a little over 1.7 million links. And this is looking at what communities can we find, what areas of the wide web scrape link to themselves more than they link to other parts of the wide web scrape. This took about 55 minutes to generate. And then we can start zooming in. There's a large job cluster. It's sort of link farm of economic development and jobs board in Canada. And there is a university. And so looking at how these different websites connect, and as I'll mention in a second, lets us know what files we actually want to look at. I've also been looking at NER, so the Wayne format sounds amazing. Here are countries mentioned in the .ca top-level domain. There's the United States, Western Europe, of course, given Canada's ties, Russia, China, Brazil, 3 countries Canada's trying to cultivate better relationships with, and whole absences in sub-Saharan Africa. Our provinces, Ontario overrepresented, Quebec underrepresented. And then here's postal codes. On their own, it's not too useful, but if we can get longitudinal data and start looking back into the earlier collections of the Internet Archive, it would be really neat to test whether economic activity is moving around Canada and how our web sphere is taking shape. So I need longitudinal data, but I think that this is a really good extreme example of the size and intensity of the sources that we're going to be facing with. Terabytes and terabytes and terabytes of information. And I think in some ways wide web scrapes hint at the dream of social history, having the voices of everyday people and being able to explore what people thought in Canada in 2011 or 1996 or 2000. And so that's the first case study. The second case study is sort of echoing off what Jefferson just presented on, and I've been working with Archive.it and the University of Toronto to look at these 2 collections, Canadian political parties and political interest groups, and the Canadian Labour Unions collection. As I said, it ranges from 05 to 06 to 2014, and it comes in WOT file format. I think of WOT files, for me, as the sweet spot. They've got more data than the CDX. The CDX is a little lightweight if I'm not diving, headfirst into all the work files. But the work files are really heavy duty unless I've got lots of grant money and time. And it sort of hints at this question of, do historians want metadata or do we want content analysis? This constant tension between historians and communication scholars and other people that at the end of the day, historians want content. I need content if I'm going to write a journal article. I need content if I'm going to write a book. And I care about content as a historian. But WOT files, and what I found with this example, really bridge this. That we need content, but the metadata obviously can help us find and contextualize it. And that's where the WOT file comes in. So for example here, and I'll let this run, knock on wood, in the background, these are the links from the Canadian Political Parties collection. And so this is a Gephi interface. At the bottom, you've got the time slider. You'll see, I'll stretch it out so you see every link visualized. We see YouTube, Twitter, Facebook. A next step is going to be extracting the user agent from those because they always dominate. And here I am, for example, zooming into the Liberal Party of Canada. And we go in there. It's not the best system. And we see here at those green websites off to the left, those are MP, members of parliament websites, the blogosphere that emerges around the Liberal Party. And that shifts over time as we move that slider. The Liberal Party is sort of our second party right now. Well, third party, technically. And then I'm going to go up to the ruling party, which is the Conservative Party of Canada. And if I go up there, again, we see now they've got a very vibrant MP sort of blogosphere around it. But when we start playing with that time slider, that actually comes along quite a bit later in this collection. By looking at the relative parties then, so Conservatives on the left, Liberals on the right, this is the opposite of their own political spectrum, but that's for fun, looking on it, and how can we use this to start discovering content? And so what I did is take those sort of modularity classes, what websites have been linking to other websites more than other websites. There's one with the Liberals. They actually got grouped in with our the second/third party. It's complicated. In Canadian politics, the NDP, and the French version highlighted there. And there's the Conservatives there. And I said, what if we take those modularity classes, then go back and get the content. We'll make calls back to the Wayback Machine, and we'll get parts of those websites and see what text we find. And so I put the results up on my website. I can tweet a link later on. You don't have to copy that down. And I basically said, let's start on 2014 where I kind of know what's going on. So let's take that conservative class from the WOT files. Let's download that content from the Wayback Machine. And we run it through topic modeling LDA, which you've seen a few times at this conference. And we're seeing topics relating to economic development, family, immigration, legislation, women's issues, senior issues, Ukrainians, constituency offices, the names of some prominent MPs, and of course, maybe not of course to you, but our economic action plan, which were billboards all over Canada last year. The Liberals were highlighting their newly elected leader, Justin Trudeau, cuts to social programs that they wanted to stop, child poverty, mental health, municipal issues, labor, workers, stop the cuts in housing. So it kind of works. We're using link structures to find these communities, and then we're topic modeling them, and we're starting to discover what are the main topics. We go back in time to 2006, and we see some interesting things. And I like these because it raises questions. So the conservatives, we saw topics relating to education, university, but a surprising amount of information on Canadian Aboriginal issues. And I was curious about this, so I talked to my colleagues, that's what I always do, and they said that's kind of weird, but given that the chief advisor on the election campaign that was just fought when these websites were being collected was Tom Flanagan, who's an influential Canadian conservative thinker on these issues. This was a big fight in Canadian politics around the Kelowna Accord. This actually makes sense, that it raises interesting questions for me to look at. Whereas the Liberals, predictably, community questions, electoral topics, universities, human rights, and child care support. So it's a really useful way for me to bridge these two levels. That content is king, but so is context. Context matters, as we've heard a few times this conference. And for me, WATs help us find the files that we need to use and to contextualize them. So it's been really useful. The final case study that I've been using is the GeoCities case study. And this is actually the archive team end-of-life torrent. There's many collections like this. Friendster, which was thrown up on the screen yesterday, is like that. There's quite a few other ones at the Internet Archive. And they're not in work format. They're not in ARC format. They were created using wgets. There are often lots of computers going at the same time, racing against a ticking clock for this content to disappear. Yahoo bought GeoCities in 1999, and then by 2009, they decided nobody wanted it anymore, and they were just going to delete it and actually give a middle finger to historians and anybody who might find this material useful. So the archive team end-of-life torrent was generated in 2009, but it's challenging because it has content dating back to 1996. That once you go through, you've got content and websites that stopped being updated in 1996, 97, 98, 99, 02, et cetera. It's a jumble. It's as it existed in 2009. Luckily, GeoCities, for those of you who know, it had a pretty unique structure. It was trying to replicate sort of spatial elements and spatial metaphors to help acclimatize people to the web. And so before 1999, if you were on GeoCities, you needed to have a neighborhood. If you were a kid, you'd go to the Enchanted Forest. If you were an academic, you might go to Athens. If you're a genealogist, you'd go to Heartland. And so all sites created pre-1999, we can use the neighborhood structure. And on my blog, I talk a lot about what we can learn and what we can't learn from these neighborhoods. But it's challenging because it's not work, it's not ARC, and so none of the tools that web archivists develop work for me. I have to use live web tools, and even them, they don't work because they don't expect you to have them mirrored on your home computer. But GeoCities has been useful because I can ask substantive research questions. I can ask questions of GeoCities that make sense to my colleagues in history departments. And so I've been asking questions like, was there community in GeoCities? Did people, how was community lived and enacted in GeoCities? Or what was it like to be a 10-year-old kid in GeoCities? What was it like to have this, for the first time in human history, young people producing sources that today I can access? It's sort of unparalleled territory. GeoCities matters because it represents this massive accumulation of public speech. That the Old Bailey has 197,000 trials over a few centuries. GeoCities, as we see here, goes from 10,000 users in October 1995 to 1 million users in October 1997. This is the kind of stuff that we've never before had access to, but it's very challenging to use. So I've been playing around. I've been topic modeling communities, these different neighborhoods. I take all the websites, I turn them into plain text using links, and I throw them to a topic modeler to see what happened. Do we find what we expect to find? What are the kids talking about in the Enchanted Forest? They're talking about Winnie the Pooh and that sort of thing. What are people talking about in Heartland? They're talking about their children and faith and God. And finding some areas that changed. The home productivity neighborhood starts out as people talking about, I think, home productivity issues, and then morphs into sort of a water cooler chat area to talk about politics and taxes and these sorts of things. I've been looking at the millions of user-contributed and generated images. And this has been really challenging, a lot of failed experiments, similar to what Jefferson was explaining. But taking millions of images, massive amounts of information for a historian, and seeing what we find. What color profiles do we have in different communities? So here we're looking at the Enchanted Forest. There's all the images just montaged in the upper right. Here we're looking at hue and saturation. And finding that, here, this is where digital photographs cluster together when you're looking at a GeoCities collection. Here, this is when you're finding a place with lots of vibrant clip art. And you zoom in, and there's a cool video that I made of this. You go in and you start seeing Winnie the Pooh and Tigger, and you can see actually by looking at the images, how they've been shared around, how they were borrowed, and how community might have been enacted when you're looking at millions of images. But most importantly, GeoCities, because it's manageable, really to me underscores the stories of significant users and our ability to learn about their meaningful experiences, to look at their high points of lives, their low points of lives, the selflessness of which community leaders threw themselves in to teach people the ropes of HTML, the award economies that stitched people together, the web rings that brought, like-minded people into communication with each other. And just recently, I had to get my slides in early, so I didn't put this in, but I've been playing with a lot of link analysis and using the Enchanted Forest, looking at who's getting the most links inbound, and we look at that and we see these are kids often who were really into awards, really into web rings, became hubs of their social networks at very, very young ages. And there's significant stories in meshing the links to the actual content itself. So of course, these all have shared problems. We never have enough processing power or memory, at least as a historian. Web archive tools are often designed for clusters. I would wager that well less than 10 historians in North America can probably use a cluster, and that's a problem, and that's on us as well. Tools are very varied. Some work on work files, some work on ARC files, some work on WAT files, and some work on live web material that we're constantly scrambling. And I think we sometimes take for granted that everybody's using works, but as GeoCities shows, we're using weird stuff too that's just out there, and that's what we're going to be using for that early history of the web. That we need to work at end user tools. We need to work on documentation so that a dummy like me can pick up a tool and use it. We need to cooperate, and this is for the historians in the room, we need to cooperate with our computer science colleagues. I know that historians are the problem in these relationships. It's not the computer scientists, it's the historians. We need to be better at playing with other people. We need to start getting back into numbers. We need to start thinking about teams. We need to start thinking about, maybe some of those quantitative historians in the 70s and 80s had the right idea. And I've been trying to do that, working a lot with Jimmy Lin lately, using Workbase as a repository for my files. But at the end of the day, the shared promise of this material that we're using with, the shared promise of being able to read and access more voices, to learn the thoughts of more people, that we're achieving the promise of social history, that I want to underscore. People who never before would have imaginatively, in any world, left a historical record for me as a historian to look at. They're now leaving them. And that's amazing. It's amazing. And I would just say that to everybody here, don't sell yourself short. That web archives are going to profoundly change the historical profession. This is a massive revolution for what it means to me as a historian and what it means to my colleagues and what it means for what we are doing and what our cultural record is going to be. So thank you very much for leaving all this material. So I think I've left some time for questions. I want to thank you very much. It's been a whirlwind tour through some of my research, but it's been a complete pleasure getting to know you all, and hopefully you have some questions for me. So thank you very much. I'll leave the inspirational message up.
Great talk. Are there questions?
Nicholas Taylor, Stanford University Libraries. You talked about some of the challenges for yourself in using web archives for your research. I'm wondering if you think that if those are the same kinds of challenges that are standing in the way of more historians using web archives for research, or if you think those challenges are different, and if so, what we could do as archivists and tool builders to help mitigate them.
Yeah, that's a good question. So are my challenges sort of, could I multiply them and apply them across the whole profession? Or?
I mean, I guess the question is mostly, how do we make more historians like yourself who are interested in working with web archives and capable?
Yeah, I mean, part of it is going to be the students coming into grad school now, this is history. And it's unequivocally history. They were born after some of this happened. But how can we make this happen? Well, first of all, some of the tools have to be a bit easier to use. So documentation is really, really important. Most historians aren't using Linux, and a lot of the tools are designed as if there's Linux. And so hopefully, and I've been trying to do this, making short little guides for these research assistants that take us from step one, you've got a computer, it's got nothing on it. Here's what you do. You go to the applications menu, you click on this button, and it keeps going. To really get buy-in, I think we just need to start highlighting the research that we're doing. So trying to talk up preliminary stuff I've been doing, some of the stuff Jefferson's been showing at the UK Web Archive, the Buddha Project, showing, think about this, guys. This is what we wish we could have had our entire lives. The sources of people that, like the example I use, when I did my first book, I was literally using like police record of graffiti on the side of a steel mill. And that was like my sole evidence for a paragraph of that book. And I went, I wish I knew what the heck had happened in Hamilton, Ontario that day. Well, I say, well, if this had happened in 1998, we would have had a record of this day. It's going to be harder to access in a different way, but the promise of social history is here, and I think that that's something historians can get behind. But we do need to have documentation, one-click tools. Web Recorder is a great example of something that, you know, anybody can use in a way that Hadoop is not something that anybody can use.
Hi, Brenda Reyes, University of North Texas. I wanted to ask you, is it, as part of your problem statement, is it part of the problem that there are not enough historians doing pre-1996 work, or are there not enough historians doing pre-1996 works that use the web, or that do they use alternative resources like archives or traditional archives or paper, and they just don't know that web archives exist as a tool?
That's a good question. So not many historians are doing 90s history yet, but there are some. And the 90s history I've seen does use traditional, they're going into newspaper archives, they're using LexisNexis. They're not accessing the web apart from occasional Wayback Machine references. My real problem statement and what I want to really get at is that this is coming. That historians as a profession were pretty slow to adapt. And that within 10 years, this is going to be part of our mainstream historiography. And if we don't start tooling up our profession, we're not going to be ready to do it. That we need to start laying the infrastructure so that when our grad students, and just now, a grad student at the university down the road, he wants to write a history of 9/11. And you can't do that unless you use web archives. And historians won't be able to write that unless we start developing methodology and a critical interest and accessible documentation and books and that sort of thing to make it accessible. So it's sort of a future thinking groundwork that we need to lay, or else this entire realm of history is off limits to us, I think.
Hi, my name is Annette. I'm a librarian at UC Santa Cruz, and my question is, I've been concerned about a lot of these things you've been talking about, so it's really great to hear someone's is working on it. But I guess this is a bit out of scope, but do you think that as a methodology that this would be something that could be a course for graduate education? Because
yes.
it sounds like new training needs to happen.
Yeah. I do, and I think it's part of historians we need more methods training. But there's been a backlash against methods courses. A lot of grad programs, many grad programs in Canada don't have any methods anymore. No shared foundation, you just futz around, which is a mistake. So yes, I think it should be a course, and I think it could be a course that gets our grad students out of their comfort level, they get lots of skills out of it, and it's going to give them that future proofing to work forward. So short answer, yes, and long answer, yeah, let's do it as a group, maybe, I don't know.
Just first of all, congratulations. That was an awesome talk.
Oh,
thank you. And I have a question which is probably a bit more detailed related to the scholarly practice. So in your effort using web archive as sources to study history, have you got any pushback from your peers? Do they regard your use of this material as not credible, for example? Mm-hmm. That's first question. So how they regard you? Do they think what you're doing is not serious, for example? And the second question is, what kind of difficulties have you come across in terms of citing the source you use, and any legal issues if you come across? So were there ever publishers insisting that you get rights cleared for a screenshot you use of a website which no longer exists, as an example?
Well, so both questions. So pushback, it's funny. It's fun to imagine sometimes that everybody's pushing back because it can be the marginalized scholar. But in general, historians have been pretty receptive to it. That they do recognize that, of course, we're going to need to do that. The pushback I have had sometimes is it's a nostalgia from personal experience. People a little bit older than myself, they hear that I'm looking at, say, GeoCities, and they go, GeoCities didn't matter. And they just have that instinctual knee-jerk of it wasn't serious, it was just people playing around on the web, and they were ugly websites that good that they were gone. But then when you start explaining, like, well, think about the Old Bailey, and that's a different context, and then think about what this is, and you can sort of reach through. But yeah, and it is being sure to ground it in historical research, to make clear that this doesn't replace anything we've done before, that this is just an evolution of current techniques in a new age. In terms of citing sources, the articles I've published, I've just cited, generally I've always, luckily that I found it in the Wayback Machine, and I cite the Wayback Machine, the Internet Archive's copy, even if I discovered it locally or through some other method, I do find the copy, because that's how somebody who's reading my article can go look at the original source. I haven't tried including screenshots, because historical journals aren't good with images in general. But yeah, that would be a discussion I'm sure I would run into. But it's often just citing as much information as possible. And just in general, I always fight with editors because I want to put more information in my citations. What search engine did I use to find the Globe and Mail newspaper article I'm using? They often don't want to do that because of Chicago style. But it's a conversation with every editor.
Hi, I am really asking you to do a bit of forecasting here. As a historian, you want to have source material, as much source material to work as possible. How do you feel that a lot of the web archives in existence today are dark archives, that you cannot access them unless you travel to the site and perhaps obtain special permission? Might that not affect the quality and the breadth and depth of scholarship in the future if historians can only access only a portion of what is available? Yeah,
that's the idea of, like, if I want to look at the UK Web Archive, I have to go to England. Is that, yeah, or that other stuff I have to beg and scrape to get somebody to give me permission for it. Obviously, I would like everything to be accessible, and that in a dream world, it would be great if somebody could sit at home in Waterloo, Canada, and access these archives from the comfort of their home. It would lower barriers. It would be more accessible to scholars who don't have grant funding. It opens up a lot of equality in our profession. But in general, that's probably not possible. And it's sort of similar to today. The current research process has always been limited. So if I'm based in New York City and I write a book, I'm probably going to tend to use sources in the Eastern Seaboard, and I'm going to tend to just sort of dip into things that are located in other countries and on the West Coast if they're not as peripheral. That historical scholarship is always influenced by where we are, and it's never been perfect. So it's getting better, but at the end of the day, as humanists, I think we just recognize, of course, we're not going to look at it all. Of course, there's going to be subjective constraints that mean that I couldn't go to London to look at the UK Web Archive for 6 months. I can only come for 1 month. That's going to skew what I have, but maybe I'll mention that in my introduction and go with it. But we do have to, and I'm guilty of this too sometimes, we have to step away from the sense that this is going to be more objective, perfect, scholarly, scientific history, that it's still going to be subject to the same failings and issues that current scholarship is. But yeah, in a dream world, I can sit at home and do it all. But I understand that's not possible.
Hi, Jane Winters from the Institute of Historical Research. It's picking up a bit on Helen's point about how other people receive what you're doing. How easy have you found it to get this work published in mainstream historical journals rather than in digital humanities publications?
Yeah.
Because that does seem to be one of the cultural problems, that they need to be able to publish in history journals, and it's quite hard to get this kind of cutting edge research published. It just doesn't fit.
Yeah, it's sort of a mix. I guess it's been a mixed response. So on one level, I found when I have a piece coming out next month in a history journal, if it's recognizable to them as it's a story with a thesis and it's got a narrative arc and it just happens to use web archives, but they're completely hidden away. And the peer reviewer, I had this article, I had peer reviewers going in, I was like, it would have been lost except the Internet Archive, which is great. And they were like, that's a Whiggish perspective. And it was, okay, fine, we'll just completely hide all our sources. So if it looks like a history article, it's fine. But historians, we don't like to have too much method. And so sometimes it's been a bit more challenging to publish and I haven't quite found the right home. You know, for some of these more general methodological reflections, the larger profile journals aren't interested really in, and it runs up against problems, and you enter into these old debates from the 1970s and 1980s that don't necessarily capture the current context. So it's challenging, but it also depends on who peer reviews it. And you know, in some cases, if you, as the community grows, and you're not going to get peer reviewed by scholars who don't understand the digital revolution, I think things can change. But so I think things are getting better as the community grows.
Oh. Thanks again.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, well, we've earned another little break.